then everybody would realize that we can't afford not to do it. And that, of course, it's costly to have clean water for everybody, but think how more costly it is to have cholera epidemics everywhere in the world. Or, yes, it's costly to come up with ways of protecting the forests, but how much more costly it is to try to replace forests that have been wiped out.
Welcome to Worth Quoting, a program sponsored by Florida Community College at Jacksonville Open Campus. We're really delighted today to be talking about the Rio Conference, or the Earth Summit, held in Rio in June of 1992. And two participants are with us here today. Hazel Henderson, who's been with us before, and we're delighted to have you, a futurist, and also Ashok Khosla, who is a sustainable developmentalist, which I'm sure you're going to have to define for us. Okay. The summit was really exciting, I know. It was the largest gathering of world leaders, and it lasted 12 days with 178 nations. And you all, I think, were there to look at the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, or to represent that point of view. Can you give us a little bit more of that, of your point of view and how you got to the summit?
Well, I've been involved in non-profit, citizen-based organizations all my life. And I went to the summit, the first Earth Summit in Stockholm in 1972, representing an NGO from the US, and also with my press credentials, because when you go to these international conferences, you try to be able to get into all of the meetings you can possibly get into. And so the idea is to have as many of these badges on and credentials as you possibly can. And the main thing that was different for me between Stockholm 20 years ago and Rio in 1992 was the role of these non-governmental organizations, because in Stockholm we were widely ignored. It seemed like back then most of the delegations were chosen because they didn't know anything about the environment. Like, for example, our US delegation, which was picked by President Nixon, was headed by Shirley Temple Black, and I'm sure she's a very nice lady, but she didn't know anything about the environment. And so the non-governmental groups were all sent to a big building, a very long, tedious bus ride away from the main tent. And we were roundly ignored. Now, in Rio, it was almost the other way around. And since my friend Ashok Khosla was involved with actually the official organizing of all of the world's NGOs, I'm going to defer to him now and let him tell you a little bit about what he saw from the Global Forum end of it.
Well, we started this process about 15, 18 months ago, when we first realized that unless we were prepared properly, we would not be able to influence governments and policymakers at Rio. So at a meeting in Europe of about 200 non-governmental organizations, it was agreed that we would set up a committee which would be in charge of all the preparations, all the possible participation at Rio of what we call the independent organizations. This led us through a process which allowed us to have, over that period of 15 months, a great deal of impact on government policies throughout the world. Some governments were more receptive than others, but the process leading to Rio, which is called the preparatory process, involved a number of committees which the governments met at on various issues, on climate change, on biodiversity, on technology transfer, and so on. And the NGOs took a very active role in helping draft papers and discussing
What kind of organizations joined with you?
Well, these are organizations ranging from advocacy and policy research institutions to grassroots level workers, people who are actually planting trees and sweeping.
But primarily environmental organizations?
They were both environmental and what we would call development organizations, organizations concerned with women's rights and women's issues, youth organizations, trade unions, even business. A number of corporate organizations, associations of businesses were involved, including the International Chamber of Commerce. And these organizations came together 15, 18 months ago with the specific purpose of ensuring that there would be an intersectoral dialogue, a dialogue which would bring in anybody who feels that they have a contribution to make to sustainable development.
So did you set the agendas then?
No. We provided a facility, a possible place where they could have their meetings. They had to set their agendas. And many of them had conflicting agendas, but that was part of the deal.
So how much work was done before people went to Rio? Were there a lot of things already agreed to before the meetings actually started?
Among governments, there were broad agreements on 3 or 4 issues. The actual final agreements were left to Rio for the heads of state and the ministers to sign. But there was a reasonable degree of agreement on climate change, a very watered-down agreement, but nevertheless there was a draft treaty which went to Rio for signature. Similarly, on biodiversity, there was a draft treaty, somewhat watered down again, but not watered down enough for the U.S. to agree to it. Then there was virtually no agreement on forests that had been expected. Unfortunately, the agenda of this meeting was largely written by northern delegations over the past couple of years. And that meant that the real issues of development, issues of poverty eradication, of equity and so on, had actually got left out. They were not on the agenda. So while we had a reasonable amount of work on global climate change and on sea level rise and on issues of biodiversity and loss of genetic resources, we did not have enough discussions on issues of poverty and the other side.
There's a big difference in perspective in the northern. I assume that you could represent the northern perspective and you would represent the southern perspective.
Well, I mean, actually, I think Ashok and I are very much on the same wavelength in terms of the way we see the debate evolving toward ideas of how you come to a sustainable form of development. So it's not that we're that far apart, but as far as the issues look from most of the northern NGOs, it's sort of, gee whiz, this is a bunch of other new things that we have to pay for, you know, gee whiz, all these new technologies, and we can't have the countries in the South develop the way we did because it's going to pollute too much, and, you know, there's all this sort of stuff going on. And what I found, I mean, putting my reporter's hat on for a moment, the big discussion at the first press conference, Maurice Strong came in, and they had a group of people. They had one of the ministers from Malaysia, who was very articulate and setting out the position of the South, and she was saying, well, here you are in these northern hemisphere countries, and you've chopped down all of your trees to develop, and now you want us to have a treaty to tell us that our trees belong to everybody. And she was very indignant and very newsworthy and all of the rest of it, you see. And so then there were all of these issues around this Agenda 21. And the Agenda 21 was a whole bunch of ways that we can move to a sustainable world, but every one of them appeared to be too expensive. And the reason they appear to be too expensive is because we still use the old scoring card as measured by the gross national product, which does not include all of the environmental costs of the way we do things now.
That's an example of one of the principles from the Agenda 20.
Well, let's say, let me try to think of a specific.
Drinking water.
Yes, or something like that. It looks like, it's too expensive to have clean drinking water. And yet the whole thing is that when we actually change the scorecard to real indicators of quality of life, which was one of the things in the Rio Declaration, the correcting of the gross national product, so we'd include these costs, and we would end up having something more like Jacksonville's quality of life indicators, or something like that, then everybody would realize that we can't afford not to do it. And that, of course, it's costly to have clean water for everybody, but think how more costly it is to have cholera epidemics everywhere in the world. Or, yes, it's costly to come up with ways of protecting the forests, but how much more costly it is to try to replace forests that have been wiped out.
How was that argument received?
Well, I think the people who had to dip into their pockets to pay found that argument not noteworthy simply because it was inconvenient. I think most of us are willing to bend logic to convenience, and I think both southern and northern delegates had this problem. But it is a source of great worry to not only governments, but particularly to independent organizations that we were working with, that the world has come to a position where we're really basically slowly recognizing that we can't mine the land anymore, that we can't mine the resources of this planet anymore without destroying certain basic values that we also cherish. But we can't go on expecting other people to have different rules and different sets of aspirations while we continue to maintain ours in the North. And I think that that has to now begin to be seen by people both in the South and the North much more clearly.
Yes, I mean, some of the things that made it a bit embarrassing to be an American, frankly, because of the fact that our delegation was so far behind in not understanding really what this debate was about, were these kind of statements that were made that, after all, if the North didn't go on consuming and have consumption leading our economic growth, as it does in the U.S., provides 60% of all of our economic growth. If we all stop heroic feats of consumption and buying more automobiles than this, we're afraid that the economic engine will go run down and all of this kind of thing. And as a matter of fact, my friend Angia Biddle-Duke, who was there part of the parliamentarians meeting that I took part in, he asked me this question in all honesty, and he chaired the, he's the chief protocol fellow at the State Department, and he asked me this question in all seriousness. If we in the U.S. stop consuming the products of the South, doesn't that mean that we'll make things worse for them? So we have to go on over-consuming. And I would say, well, you have to take it from the top and unravel all of this logic around that. And once you do that and realize that there are other ways to run an economy where all the jobs are not based on advertising force-fed consumption of junk and piles of stuff thrown into landfills. There are other ways to run an economy. And so the Americans were so behind in understanding that this was the basis of the debate that I don't know whether you noticed that, Ashok. But
did they come along? Did you make any progress?
No, I think this time around, the pressures of the electoral year and so on are just too high for us to expect too much of a change. In policy, there are external forces much bigger than the environment or planetary survival at work, so we have to accept that. But I guess in due course, when these things are shaken down and the economy sort of gets back on its feet early next year, I think there will be people. After all, this is a great nation, and people do think in the U.S. about these issues. That was clear from many of the independent organizations there. These issues will come back onto the agenda.
You mentioned
so far, no.
The treaties earlier, and where the climate one, the biodiversity, different species one, and then the forest one. Do you feel like the most important things were done, or you feel like that the forest one was not signed and didn't get as far enough along?
That was kind of a non-starter, wasn't it?
The forestry one fell by the wayside a long time ago.
A long time ago.
There were countries both in the North and the South who were against it.
Okay.
And so it didn't work, it didn't take off. The climate change one was agreed upon only about a month ago, after a long process of very detailed negotiation, a month before the Rio conference. And that basically was a highly watered down agreement, mainly because the U.S. did not want to find itself committed to targets and timetables for achieving them on carbon emissions. The costs of that were expected to be too high.
And I mean, it was sad because the Europeans were all ready to go on that,
Everyone
you
else
see, and so we were, you know, I mean, if you had seen the way the U.S. was played in the Brazilian newspapers and all of the media down there, it really was embarrassing. I mean, and particularly the whole question of jobs, you know, which was one of the things that scuttled the forest convention, is that Mr. Bush brought up the issue of the jobs that would be lost if we didn't keep on cutting timber. But I mean, almost everybody knows now, even economists agree, that you can create jobs by digging holes and filling them in. I mean, there is such an enormous menu of new jobs in the new clean technologies in all of these emerging industries. And if we go towards energy efficiency, not only will we create more jobs in the American economy, but I mean, we'll become more competitive worldwide. I mean, we're spawning a whole new industry here. And this is one of the things, of course, that the Competitive Council that Vice President Quayle heads up hasn't really caught on to, that this is a whole new area of competitiveness, and the Japanese are already beating us at this next world market if we don't get on the ball.
Competitiveness is going to be the fundamental issue as prices of energy go up. You can't go on wasting energy at this rate and still be competitive when energy will cost its real cost to society, to the environment. So I think these are fundamental issues that will force people to think about them. But at the moment, we have on our hands treaties, one of which has been signed by the U.S., the climate change, which means very little at the moment, and the Biodiversity Treaty, which has been signed by a number of countries except the U.S., and that is also not one of the most dramatic breakthroughs in thinking, but nevertheless provides the basis for future work.
The Ozone Treaty, which was signed previously, is now in the news. We're now seeing governments react to that. Do you feel that these other ones will have the same sort of impact eventually?
Eventually, won't they,
Yeah.
Ashok? I mean, I think something was started there at Rio that is going to keep on snowballing for the rest of this century. I mean, there's a whole bunch of new meetings are planned, and there was a commission talked about, wasn't there, this...
Make no mistake about it, Rio was an important event and a very positive beginning of a new era. It's simply that as an event, it did not produce the outputs that a lot of people, including ourselves, went in expecting. But I think the process has started by which a great deal will be done over the next 10, 15 years.
I don't think
do
people
too,
had
yeah.
seriously considered environment on the same par as development
That's right.
worldwide before. I mean, this becomes the international issue.
Exactly.
Yes, I mean, and it's almost now become part of the whole debate about international security. I mean, you remember during the Cold War, there was only one definition of security, and that was military, you know, did you have weapons and all of this. And people are suddenly realizing that environmental security and security in terms of a sustainable way of a society developing are much more important and fundamental, you know, than how many bombs and guns people have. I mean, look how ridiculous that is. They don't solve any... How many problems ever got solved with the Patriot missile? You know?
Not very many, at least not permanently anyway. What about the things that were achieved and weren't, the things that you think are the most important? You've said that this is a very important conference. Is there a highlight there that you're going to continue to see that's going to really make a difference?
I think the achievements were on the process side rather than the substantive side. The governments over the past 50, 60 years have really controlled how the world economy runs. They've controlled how political decisions are made on a global level. They've controlled virtually all global discussions to the exclusion of anyone else. This is the first time that a major input, a major set of inputs, major contributions were made by people other than governments to a whole process. It's true that at the Rio conference itself, the independent sectors were a little peripheralized for a variety of reasons, partly because it was the real thing, and governments at the last minute realized that, partly because logistically it was the distance between the NGO meetings, the non-governmental and independent meetings was quite large from the main conference. But it seems to me that the fundamental breakthrough that has occurred is that over a 2-year process of preparing for this meeting, non-governmental agencies of various types, including big corporate business and trade unions and women's groups and varieties of church groups and interfaith people and so on, have had a very deep and very pervasive impact on the discussions and on the final output. I think that that's going to make a big difference for the future.
One of the things that was mentioned but not really dealt with that I read in the paper was about population. Maybe you can address that a little bit, maybe add your own comments about most important.
Yes, I mean, to me, one of the really important things that happened in Rio, which involves also the population issue, the main complaint leading up to Rio was, oh, the issue is there's too many issues, they're trying to solve all the world's problems at once. And yet, to me, it's part of the whole shift in our understanding that the old model of being able to have these fragmented view of the world where we would solve this problem and then we would solve this problem and then we would solve this problem. It doesn't work like that, and we realize that it's all one planet, and yes, all these issues, population, environment, poverty, ozone, water, all did belong together. And that was an immense intellectual breakthrough, and at some point I hope it's going to start feeding back to academic curriculum, where we realize that we can't go on teaching as if all of these things are separate. And one of the proposals I made to the Secretary General at the first press conference, Maurice Strong, was, for example, that we need to send all the economists back to school and give them an interdisciplinary education and make them recertify themselves so that they learn all of the interacting forces before they're really certified to tell us now what is human development.
So what kind of preparation do you need to look at this incredibly complex, interactive, ecological system?
You need an interdisciplinary education. And to me, that was really the wonderful thing about Rio, was the fact that everybody was having to deal with all of the issues and realizing you couldn't solve them one at a time. Did you?
I think that's correct. I think it's not simply a matter of mastering or being able to bring together the resources of different disciplines to make a good decision. There's a more fundamental issue which was highlighted by a meeting both Hazel and I were at the very beginning of the Rio conference, and that was the need for thinking about the other sector's viewpoint, the other constituencies' viewpoint. It is not possible for us to say, well, we want more jobs, we're trade unions, or we want more clean environment, we're green organizations, whatever, without trying to see what that implies in terms of other wider constituencies' own needs. And that the ultimate solution has to be a way of understanding that there are fundamental differences, we have to live with them. There are certain areas in which these differences may not be as fundamental as all that. We can find convergences and consensus of various types. But the basic issue that becomes important is that we must now learn to see that our self-interest in the long run, and not the very long run for that, within our own lifetimes, involves taking care of the self-interest of many others. And that
this is the boat with the hole in it, as you talk about.
Oh, and it was so nice to see when people began to really do that, that you got the sense that you could build coalitions. And when you take this kind of systemic view, it was possible to hear all kinds of people who probably never thought of this before talk about the population problem in a whole new way. Instead of, oh, well, we just have to make sure everybody has birth control pills and things like this. Almost everybody, officially and unofficially, said that the best contraceptive was educating and empowering women. See, that's a systemic viewpoint. You've done a lot of work. You've trudged all the way through the system to finally get to understand that, you know.
now people actually mouth that as basically a platitude.
It was a truism.
Truism.
Yes.
It was an accepted thing.
Yes,
It wasn't even debated.
No, and
we don't
part,
need to debate that anymore.
and it was amazing. I mean, a friend of mine who is a member of the Parliament of Europe, and she was an early member of the Green Party, she was just saying that she'd seen the evolution of that, where the understanding that empowering women, that there will be no sustainable development in the world without empowering women, because women are most of the farmers in the world. They grow most of the food, you know, in most countries in the world. And so there were little
carriers of knowledge. You see, they are the ones who essentially impart
teach the children.
Teach the children and their husbands and what it is that living with nature means. And you know, I think that's a very important part of that.
Yes.
That's fascinating.
So it was quite amazing. I mean, if you can imagine this scene, we're all taking place, the citizens' organizations were in this very hot, sweaty atmosphere. It was about 90 degrees, wasn't it? And they were all in these hundreds of tents that were really extremely hot, and we all managed to keep going, mopping our brows. But there was a lot of wonderful goodwill and coalition building that's going to stand us instead for many years to come.
So what is the next step? Is there you said there's some meetings, is there something formal? Is there another one of these planned in 10 years or 5 or 1?
Maybe sooner. There were more than 17,000 participants at this independent meeting. There were 9,000 odd journalists. There were a very large number of Brazilian NGOs on top of that. On any given day, towards the end, we were getting 40 to 50,000 people in this park where all these activities were taking place, many of them interested in the environment. I would say that we are now witnessing a whole new era where initiatives will be coming more and more from outside of government. And I believe there will be certainly a meeting of a sizable nature in the next 3 years or so, simply to look at the need for monitoring, what it is that the government's promised and agreed to do, and how much they've been able to do in that period.
And then there was one other theme, too, that I'd like not to forget, and that was the theme of innovation, technological innovation and green technologies. And one of the things that I did as part of my program was to speak at a Brazilian expo of green technologies, and it was taking place right next to the Rio Center, a great big whole new building that they had built for the, you know, for the event. And there were hundreds of companies from all around the world showing different ways of recycling and different ways of reconditioning soil and creating solar energy and hydrogen and alternative automobile engines. And that process is snowballing. I mean, I think there's going to be
some good news and some hope that came out of it near the end. Well, I really appreciate both of you being here, and I hope that you all have enjoyed this as much as I have about talking about the Rio Conference, the Earth Summit of June 1992. This is Carol Miner, your host.